Good afternoon, and welcome back. We are excited and indeed delighted to conclude our observance and celebration of Women's History Month. And we're concluding in a marvelous way by celebrating Dr. Lisa Davison, the Johnny Argo Chadjo Professor of Hebrew Bible and Christian Church Disciples of Christ Director of Denominational Formation. We gather to congratulate her on her latest publication, More Than a Womb, Child-Free Women in the Hebrew Bible as Agents of the Holy. Dr. Ali Utley, Assistant Professor of Liturgy and Practical Theology, will share her experience and her thoughts from her reading of Dr. Davison's book. She'll conclude by posing a few questions for our reflection, and probably Dr. Davison's reflection as well. We'll then invite Dr. Davison to respond to Dr. Utley as a way of concluding the review. And should time allow, we also will invite questions from those of us who are gathered that we hope Dr. Davison will be happy to respond to. So we now begin with the review from Dr. Ali Utley.
Thank you, Dean Butler, for the invitation and the opportunity to review the book. And thank you, Dr. Davison, for this incredible contribution to the field. I'm going to set my timer here so that if I do go over, it's at least on purpose. So first, again, thanks for this book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I found both the content and the style to be engaging. It had both depth and accessibility, and from a practical theologian, I think accessibility is like the highest compliment. I thought that the book was both scholarly and playful, a masterclass in constructing ideas and bolstering them with other work done in the field. Dr. D's feminist commitments are evident from the first page to the last. Using her own experience as a child-free woman, she reads every biblical text, quote, seeking to see beneath the overt and implicit propaganda present in the production of these stories, evaluating the gender constructs at work, asking questions about how the texts conceal and reveal the voices and concerns of women, end quote. This book left me once again bewildered and frustrated by the patriarchy, by the persistent and pervasive reduction of women, but also gave me and other readers an alternative way to look at a set of Hebrew Bible texts. Provides a reading that subverts the dominant narrative that women are only good for being wives and having babies. In her own words, quote, this book lifts up women who, working with the divine, play amazing roles in the stories of Israel. They are prophets, judges, worship leaders, warriors, scholars, and scribes. They help people celebrate God's triumph over oppression. They speak boldly to those in power. They go into battle to secure their people's safety. They give wise judgments in important legal matters. They authenticate texts and inspire reform to help Israel return to the way of Torah in ways that were not tied to their wombs and fertility. They make Israel's story possible and help it to continue to future generations, end quote. By the way, I love that last line, tying child-free women to the survival, the continuation of a community. There are more ways to leave a legacy than to procreate. With a book like this, I can't summarize each chapter, but I want to highlight some key terms, some of which you will have already heard this morning in chapel, and offer a summary of one chapter so you can see the methodology at work. So in the introduction, Dr. Davison introduces the term motherize, a quote, process by which a woman who is not a mother is made to become like a mother so that others feel more comfortable, end quote. Some examples of motherizing offered in the book are a church on Mother's Day, when communities, in an attempt to be inclusive and not hurt feelings, honor all women in the congregation. Dr. Davison gives a personal example in which she compares writing a book to birthing of a child, inadvertently motherizing herself. And of course, motherizing shows up in the Bible when interpreters identify women as the wife of or the mother of instead of by their name or their role, and when interpreters assume women of the Bible must have husbands and children, even when the text and the context contain no reference to husbands or children. Dr. Davison challenges the reader to look at the women of the Hebrew Bible with a new interpretive lens, and insists that motherhood and womanhood do not have to be synonymous. She opens up the possibility that, quote, a woman's not having offspring was seen not as a restriction or a curse, but instead as a viable option and a pathway to broader or different participation in communal life, end quote. In addition to motherize, another term, child-free. In the biblical context, quote, this term applies to female characters who are never described as biological mothers or as barren, end quote. In a broader cultural context, this term is also used by people who are child-free by choice. Child-free is a preferred term to childless, which implies a lack, that a woman is somehow less than for not being a mother. Dr. Davison asked the question, what possible role could a child-free woman have in the ancient Near East? There's a lot of answers. Cultic personnel, priests, prophets, diviners, maybe even interpreters of religious texts. They could be midwives. They could be warriors and military commanders, scribes and messengers. Quote, within the Hebrew Bible, females are portrayed as doing work that extends beyond the household and perhaps requires a certain freedom that child-free women enjoyed, end quote. So two stories really stuck out to me. The stories of Miriam and the story of the medium of Endor, perhaps because I study worship, and these are women who engage in ritual acts and ritual behavior. But all of the women in this book, Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, Esther, the medium of Endor, the wise woman of Tekoa, the wise woman of Abel, I was schooled in the women of the Hebrew Bible. To be honest, even if I had learned about Huldah in my Hebrew Bible class, I had forgotten her. And I only know of the medium of Endor because of an obscure round of bar trivia I played once. And these women that I had already heard of, I was able to see in a new, much more compelling light. For the sake of time, I have chosen the character Miriam, and will attempt a summary of the chapter so you can get a glimpse into the rhythm of the book and how Dr. Davison reads these characters from a child-free feminist perspective. Miriam is the subject of chapter 3 of the book. So at the outset, it is pointed out that the text itself provides no evidence that Miriam was married or a mother. And yet, scholars still continue to place her in that role. They motherize her by writing about her as a symbolic or figurative mother, as if her credibility or authority or personhood doesn't exist outside of the realm of motherhood. I think that Dr. Davison also implies that motherizing suggests that only mothers can nourish and preserve life, which we will see is not true. Miriam is first presented in the Bible and in this book as a prophet and worship leader. A reading from Exodus. Then the prophet Miriam took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. In this chapter, there's excellent exegetical work to support the idea that it wasn't only the women that went out with Miriam, but that she, in fact, leads the whole community in song and celebration of God's acts of deliverance for the people of Israel. And the song Miriam sings is prophetic. Dr. Davison writes, quote, the essential task of a prophet was to tell the people what they needed to hear, even when it was not what the people wanted to hear. Miriam's song and actions meet both of these criteria. They explain what happened at the Yom Suf from a divine perspective. and they assure the people that their God sides with the oppressed over and against the oppressor, end quote. In the next section of this chapter, the reader is introduced to Miriam as a challenger of authority. The next time Miriam shows up in scripture is in Numbers 12, and she challenges the authority of Moses, asking, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has the Lord not spoken through us also? Subsequently, the anger of the gods the anger of the Lord was kindled against her, and she became leprous. She was consequently excluded from the community for 7 days. So Dr. Davison starts unpacking this narrative with a word study, suggesting that the Hebrew might lead us to believe it was only Miriam, and not both Miriam and her brother Aaron, that challenged Moses. This would explain why only Miriam is punished. And there are several poignant questions in regard to this text. Was she seen as a threat to Moses' authority? Was she seen as a threat to an all-male power structure? What is Miriam's true concern here? After exploring these questions, supported by the work of other biblical scholars, Dr. Davison concludes that this particular story, the story of Miriam challenging Moses, suffering the consequences, and rejoining the community, this story shows the reader how important Miriam is to the Israelites. Because while she was shut out from the community the 7 days of leprosy, the people stayed and they waited. They did not leave without her. Quote, Miriam was the people's prophet. Her presence was seen as vital for their safe passage through the unknown of the wilderness, end quote. With this last sentence, Dr. Davison does a brilliant job setting up the next section titled Miriam as Source of Life for the People. Miriam's presence was indeed vital because after she died, the biblical text says there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. Reminds me of the Jonah Mitchell song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And lastly, the book describes Miriam as liberator. In Micah 6:4, we read, For you were brought up from the land of Egypt, and I redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Dr. Davison writes, quote, it is significant that the prophet Micah includes Miriam as part of the divinely chosen freedom trio remembered as heroes of the Exodus, despite efforts by later editors to erase or downplay her leadership. By the time of Micah, her memory tenaciously lingered, end quote. It turns out that there is more to Miriam's story than a 10-word song, an opening act to the Moses headliner. This chapter is rich, helping the reader to know Miriam as prophet, worship leader, challenger of authority, source of life, liberator, and child-free woman. Each chapter ends with a poem. We heard one of them in worship this morning. And it functions as a summary. So I'm going to read one. You can get a glimpse of the things that I left out. But also, I think these poems are a way to ingrain the stories of these powerful women into the reader's imagination and into our memory. She writes, I am Miriam. I have no call story, yet I am called a prophet. I am not identified as a priest, yet I am of priestly lineage and led a religious ritual. I am chastised for seeking equality, yet the people would not continue without me. I was buried at a place called Holy, Kadesh, yet you don't know my age. I was silenced by androcentric interpretations, yet Micah names me among the liberators. My story is incomplete, yet I am not forgotten. I am grateful for this contribution to the church, to the academy. I feel empowered and validated as a child-free woman. I am more familiar with the women of the Hebrew Bible. I am noticing and thinking about all the ways culture then and now motherize women. And I now have a resource to share with people who have dangerously limited the understanding of biblical womanhood. So I will end with a comment and a couple of questions to which you can respond to any or none. But before reading this book, it never occurred to me to think of these women as being child-free, or to presume that they had children and the text just didn't mention it. I didn't think of most of these women in relationship to children at all. So this book had a bit of what my students from the intensive I decided to call the "we don't talk about Bruno" effect, if you've watched Encanto a few times. So by writing a book about child-free women, are you drawing attention to this relationship to children that may or may not have been obvious to some readers? Or is there something about being intentional in claiming this identity of child-free woman? I also, as I was reading, kept trying to think of another way, a way disconnected from motherhood or motherizing, to describe my relationship to the children in my community. So obviously being child-free in a biological or adoptive sense doesn't mean your life is void of children, although it might be. So I just kept wondering, how do we think about or name our intergenerational communal relationships without being constrained by gender constructs or these familial norms that we have? And then my last question, I know that you're a Hebrew Bible scholar, but I also know you to be a person of faith. And I'm wondering how this work has changed the way you read and interpret the New Testament, particularly in relationship to barrenness and forced motherhood, which I didn't mention in my review, but you talk about in the opening of your book. Does this work that you've done challenge the way you think about immaculate conception or incarnation, or what I would think of now as a motherizing concept like new life in Christ? All this birth imagery that we have in the New Testament. I'm wondering the impact this work has on your interpretation of the life of Jesus Christ. So thank you so much for the opportunity to read and reflect on this book, and I look forward to your response.
Well, where to start the thank yous? Thank you, of course, to Dean Butler and our worship team and Professor Southard and Dr. Utley, and to all of you who are here, whether physically or joining us via the miracle of our technological world. I also kind of have to stop and say a word that when President Pittman was Dean Pittman, and we did these book party celebrations, she liked to point out that I had actually brought this custom to Phillips. It was something we had done at my previous seminary, a way of celebrating one another's work, to be very collegially supportive, etc. And she sometimes would point out that I brought it, but I had never enjoyed this new procedure, and that someday she hoped I would get to do that. So finally, the day has come, only 12 years later. But it is really amazing that people want to read your work at first, and then they might have nice things to say about it or critical suggestions. It just overwhelms me. I'll be honest and a little vulnerable here. I haven't written very much, mainly because I never really think I have a lot to say that people would want to read. So I nowadays do more talking than I do writing, which is the reverse of where I was in my undergraduate career and my seminary career. I was much more a writer than a speaker. But that's what, let's see, almost 26 years of teaching. No, is it that long? Yeah, 26 years of teaching will do to you. You raised great questions, Dr. Utley and Professor Southard, in your sermon. And I'm really glad that you chose Deborah, because I say at the beginning of the book that Deborah was never my favorite character because she acted like a man. That's what I used to say. How terrible of that. And then to choose Miriam, as well as the medium of Endor. People ask me when I've been doing book discussions with churches that get together to read the book, and they say, who is your favorite character? And I'm like, well, when I started, my favorite character was not even in the book. I liked the Queen of Sheba. My least favorite character when I started was Esther, because I had fallen into the very strong feminist critique that Esther used her sexuality to get what she wanted. I hope you'll read the book so you'll see that I don't put her into that cubbyhole. I think she has an important role, as well as Vashti, which surprisingly, I left Vashti out of this book, so I'm making a list of maybe people for the next book. But the medium of Endor was one of my favorites. And she gets so maligned from the beginning because she's called the witch of Endor. And, we all see a witch, we think negative things. And I'm not saying that the Deuteromistic history wouldn't have had a problem with a witch. But when we read her story closely, we see she's never condemned for what she does. And she cares for Saul in one of his most difficult moments of his life. And she's a powerful ritual expert. She gets things done. So I'm glad you chose her as well. So to answer a couple of the questions, I like the "we don't talk about Bruno" idea, because yes, a lot of people have never really thought about whether or not these women had children. And honestly, I didn't think it mattered. But after however many years of being an adult female who did not have children, who had faced all the questions, all the insinuations, all the critiques of that status, I finally thought, okay, where can I go to kind of help women who are in my position, but maybe even more importantly, women who wish to be mothers but by circumstance are not? Find stories, if they're of a faith that holds the Bible to be somehow authoritative, find stories of women who are celebrated for everything but their fertility. And that's what got me to looking. And when I started looking at women, I found that the most feminist of voices I had been formed with still motherized these characters. Miriam was like a mother to Moses. I said, really? In the wilderness, when she's challenging him, maybe that's a mother, but why does she have to be a mother? And as Dr. Utley mentioned, when I wrote in the intro to my first book, Preaching the Women of the Bible, I did use the metaphor of birth. And I thought, oh my gosh, it is deeply ingrained in all of us. So I think that it was my going in search of stories more than just, oh, these women don't have children. Again, it was a matter of stepping back and thinking that through. And there are women that I didn't include that I would like to go back for. You're talking about naming intergenerational relationships, especially for a child-free woman or child-free person who has relationships with children. I always tell folks, don't motherize me, but I do love children. I've always loved children. I have, 5 nieces and nephews, and I have, 7 nieces and nephews, and I have 9 great nieces and nephews. And my oldest nephew, I was 12 when he was born. So we grew up together. And I also did a lot of babysitting. So I saw the job of motherhood up close and personal, and I knew that that took a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of love and commitment, and I wasn't going to enter into that situation lightly, especially since I had a choice. So I often want us to reclaim a term like aunt. I'm a really good aunt. When my nieces and nephews graduated from high school, Michael and I took them on a trip to New York City on a cruise. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had had my own children. So I think auntie is a good, and I know there are cultures and communities in the United States that auntie is a very powerful term. It hadn't been in my culture, so that's one of the ways. But even to find new names of like, I'm not helping to birth, I don't birth something, but I might be a midwife. That's another way. One of my students at my previous seminary, when she was ready to graduate, brought me a gift, and the statue is on my desk, and it was of a pregnant woman. And I looked at her and thought, do you know something I don't know? And she said, no, let me explain. Because I was like, if this student says I have mothered her into this place, I might have to go and take a walk. And she said, no. She said, you have been a midwife. You have helped me give birth to my voice in the seminary where I wasn't the dominant theological perspective. And that works. So there are lots of different ways to name those that don't even rely on family. But auntie, uncle, all those I think are very powerful ways of naming those relationships. And, you know, if something had happened, God forbid, I would have taken in my nieces and nephews and raised them because that's how important they were to me. It just wasn't my call, wasn't my sense of needing that. As I joke, I think when, you know, they were making babies up in heaven, you know, I don't believe this, but just fun, bear with me. And the sign said, go this way for a biological clock and a maternal instinct. There must have been something much better over there. Because I went that way. Maybe go this way for a chocolate desire or something like that. So, and your question about the New Testament, I first wanted to say, well, we don't talk about Jesus. Which is a very common phrase in Dr. D's classes. We don't talk about Jesus, he's not here right now. But that is a good question. Someone asked me, why didn't you include New Testament? And I said, well, really, the emphasis on fertility is not as heavy in the New Testament. Women aren't as much about fertility, but certainly we have, you know, Elizabeth being barren, that same kind of story, and then we have Mary. And I have heard and read and have some ideas about Mary being a forced mother. It wasn't her choice. And so forced motherhood can happen. Doesn't mean bad will result, good can result, but giving women that choice again. So yeah, when I talk about baptism or something along those lines, I'm not gonna use any more of those more birthing images. I want to see it more as like, it's an old image, but like the cocoon and the butterfly that emerges, that's a transformation rather than some sort of rebirth. Now, I know there was that conversation that unless someone be reborn, they blah, 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 but we'll skip that one. That's Dr. Carter and Dr. Carter's area, and not mine. But that is a good question. And I do think that when I started out, let me back up and not say it that way. When I started out, I debated, do I want this to be a scholarly book that only scholars will read? Or do I want this to be a book that people in the congregations and in other settings could read and get something out of it? And I decided in good Hebrew Bible fashion that it didn't have to be either or. I wanted it to be both and. I wanted it to be accessible, but I wanted to have the scholarship there for those who would want to see that. So there is a high number of footnotes in that effort. And in fact, one of my, I guess she would be my aunt on Michael's side of the family, got this book for Christmas, not from me, but from my mother-in-law and father-in-law. And she's a very traditional, dare I say, fundamentalist Christian. And I was like, really, you're sending her the book? And she did try to read some of it, and what she said to my father-in-law was, there were so many footnotes. Like, I could go look this up if I wanted to see if she was right about something. And I thought, well, she got what footnotes are really all about. So if it can be accessible, if it can give some hope to women and new ways of thinking of themselves, because even in the 21st century, being child-free is not as readily accepted as we might want it to be, particularly, I think, in churches for very good reasons, but still. If that's the case, then I really feel like I've done what I set out to do. I was concerned how the text would be received by a Jewish audience, because I know for Judaism, reproduction still is a very important part of their lives, having the next generation of Jews. I was able to have a book conversation in which a rabbi was a part of it. And I asked him, and he said, no, He said, I think this is fine. My community would be able to engage this without any problem. It's not that you're bashing mothers. You just are trying to talk about something beyond motherhood or something other than motherhood. And the poems I wrote at the end, I did that because my writing coach thought maybe I should introduce each chapter that way. And I thought, well, if I do that, then they won't read the rest of the chapter. I'm a seminary professor. I've been a seminary student. I know what we read, the beginning and the end, and we move on. So I decided to try my hand at it and put it at the end. And the rabbi said, you know, those poems were midrash. You were simply doing midrash. And I was like, thank goodness, because that's what I thought I was doing. But I'm always very careful not to, you know, claim something from another tradition without making certain that I'm being respectful of that. So I think that's all I need to say, and I know we're out of time, but I don't have anywhere else to be. So if y'all have a question, I don't know how much longer I can stand up here, but I will say that there are books, if you'd like to have one. Michael has them for purchase, and I can sign them. The going rate, I think, is $15, which is cheaper than what you can get them on at Amazon. So, yes, Dr. Carter.
On the book. I think that's a wonderful accomplishment. I wonder if the book has received any reviews in any national publications or anything like that yet.
How convenient that you might ask that at this time. I just this morning found out that my book has been reviewed in the Christian Century. In fact, if you go to the Christian Century website, it should be at the very top of what you see when you get there. An Episcopal priest wrote the review, and she was very, very complimentary of my work and appreciative of my work. So that was a total, complete shock to get that. Michael had found it and emailed me, and I was lecturing on the prophets and hadn't had time to check my email till we took a break. So thank you for that question, Dr. Carter. Anybody else have a question? Comment? Yes. Dr. Bessler, wait for your microphone.
Well, Dr. Davison, thank you for the book and today for your comments. I'm wondering to what extent did you think about a political audience for this book? We have a Supreme Court that's looking at likely rolling back, at least, protections for women under Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. And as I even read the title of your book, there seems to be an implicit audience or an implicit argument that, in fact, the thinking here of late in conservative legislatures is quite reductive. Mm-hmm. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes. As a matter of fact, one of our alums, Reverend Kelly Becker, was reading my book as some of that was happening early on. And she wrote about how this book addresses the issues of women's freedom to choose. And that because we do have people who reduce us to our womb as the only thing we're good for, that kind of legislation moves along. But if we could go back and reclaim women as persons and not biological machines, for the reproduction of the other term I learned doing this book really was pro-natalism, the idea of trying to reproduce to build the nation, which I think we see in much of what's happening in the politics. So I do think it has that message. As Professor Southard mentioned, you know, there's always an awkwardness when I'm doing Women of the Hebrew Bible because it is a fairly binary setup, not completely, but binary setup in the Hebrew Bible. But I do think, again, if we can move the identity of women away from their reproductive function, that removes one more argument about what makes a woman, and if we can move away from the function of women and the function of marriage to be simply procreation, that can take another argument away from the anti-freedom to marry. So even though that's not my intention, I think just by even starting to unpack some things with gender and sexuality, it could help us move on to a broader understanding of what makes a woman, et cetera. Yes, Dr. Maurice Brubaker.
So I'm thinking about, since you brought up reproductive justice, I'm thinking about kind of the flip side of the pro-natalist, like women, you should bear children, and thinking about how like some communities of women through the exact same legislative measures are kept from parenting their own children because they're constructed as baby vessels and then deemed defective. And so then the state has the right to intervene with forced sterilization and taking children away and, you know, doing cross-cultural adoption without the appropriate, well, that's a whole other discussion. So I think I have ideas about what your book could speak into that space, but I assume you know it better than I do a little bit, maybe spending, you know, a decade with it. So I was curious what you would say about how your book can also speak into the space of people who are prevented from mothering their own children by being constructed as defective women or less than women.
Well, I think, yes, just the mere chance of helping women be understood as full persons and that they should have the choices to do with themselves and their bodies and whatever that they want to would help any argument in that area. So I do think that's possible. I have to ponder that a bit more, but yeah, I think about women who do have children not because they chose to, but they didn't have access to birth control. I often say the reason why my mom really got this child-free thing is I truly believe she didn't want to be a mother. But not because, and she loved us, don't get me wrong, but in 1953, I think it was when they got married, she didn't have the choices I had. And I think she got it. Not everybody gets it. Not everybody's mother gets it. My mother-in-law didn't get it quite as easily, but she has now. So I do think that the choice, the accessibility, the recognition that you can choose, all those things are in the book, but certainly beyond just whether or not you procreate, but how you're treated as a human being in this world. So thank you for that question. And I see the dean coming up.
This has been a wonderful moment of celebration. And on behalf of Phillips Theological Seminary, the community that you love and loves you, we present you with this framed cover of your book. Please enjoy it.
And I will say, I did not choose the cover, but I love it in many ways, though I'm not trying to read too much into it. But it is rather eye-catching. So, do you want a picture of here?